G'day. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land we're gathered upon here today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Wow, I'm tired. My voice has just done that Minnie Mouse thing that I hate. I've got quite a lot of information to give you, so if it's a complex question, normally I'm fine, but just in the purposes of time, I'm really happy to talk to anybody afterwards. So, but if there's something that you don't understand, please put your paw up in the air so I can clarify things for you. There's lots of connections there if you're interested in stalking me in cyberspace, which is always fun. So if you don't have much of a life between doula gigs, go for it. One of the things that was really interesting for me before we start, and it is odd for me, by the way, to talk about my research without having to take people by the paw and walk them through what an end-of-life doula is. Is anyone in the room not clear? Because I can do that if it's going to be helpful. So a couple of things that stood out were Concierge of Death in the USA. Somebody really likes The Blacklist on Netflix. Intimate Stranger was quite a lovely sort of description. We hear amicus mortis a little bit, the friend to of death, the friend to the dying, thanks to retired palliative care Dr Michael Barbato, who runs a midwifing death course in Australia. And one that was quite interesting was Funeral Guide, there at the bottom. And that came from a participant in the USA, because this is an attempt to degender what doulas are called. So the idea of, and the framework around identity did come up quite a lot in my research. I do want to point out to midwife, I know that we have sole midwives here in the UK, but midwife is a highly medicalised term in Australia, and unless you have specialist midwife nurse training, you're not allowed to use it. So you will never see anyone in Australia attach midwife and doula unless you've got a birthing doula who is also a qualified midwife. That sometimes happens, but it's pretty rare. I'm just giving you some context. Right, and as I mentioned yesterday, in one of the Q&As with Dr Mannix, a lot of us are very happy to use end-of-life doula at the moment, because death is just very quick in a moment. And often what we offer can, as you know, can span months or even years in some cases. Right, so end-of-life doulas offer humour, compassion, silence, acceptance and support for the dying, and often for caregivers to the dying. So I just wanted to give you a glimpse of a slide that I use quite frequently to people outside of the field to help them understand what we do. I'm fine if you want to photograph slides, by the way. And are these slides going to be made available? Ali's nodding? Great. Okay, so don't worry if you can't do happy snaps now, that's all right. One of the things that we are also very interested in engaging in discussions around at the moment in Australia is how on earth we can educate the biomedical field, doctors in particular. We've got some wonderful doctors who actually are very good about conversations around death and dying. And one of them, so here's some trivia about me. I have face blindness, if I haven't already told you. So like your national treasure, Joanna Lumley, and our chief scientist in Australia, Dr. Carl, I don't remember faces, which means I also suck at remembering names. The next time I meet you, if you could just say, hi, I'm insert name here, we met at the gathering, that's a really useful thing for me. And if I walk past you in the corridor and I don't say hi, it's not actually because I'm deliberately trying to be rude, I just don't recognize you, and I'm sorry in advance. But I told you that to tell you this. There's a wonderful Indian-Australian doctor, and she's actually put out her second book about conversations with patients about dying. So this is an aspect of work that's beginning to be bridged, but it is a point of frustration, sometimes of sorrow, sometimes of anger, that I heard from participants in 3 of the 4 countries. Didn't hear it in Canada, because I only spoke to one person in Canada, and that's a really juicy story that I'll get to in a minute. But from the UK, at times, certainly in Australia, and often in the USA, there's this frustration with the disconnect. And of course, this is a cultural shift. This is not going to happen overnight. this is something that arguably may even be generational. We may be looking at a couple of decades here. So something else that happened that's important for the context of my research is people, particularly in the UK, weren't responding to emails in the first wave of my recruitment. And I couldn't figure out why until someone here in the UK emailed me back and said very politely, in that careful tone of email, for the very, very heart of thinking, "You have already interviewed me. You may wish to check your records." And that's when I realised that people thought I was attached to Flinders University. And if you're not an academic, it's not going to make any sense. You're like, Western Sydney University, Flinders, yeah, it's a university, who cares? It's like one big university out there. So once I clarified, no, I'm not actually part of the Flinders team, I'm with a different institution, and by the way, this is an independent project, and I myself am an End of Life Doula. I'm a practitioner. All of a sudden, doors started opening, and people were really eager to talk to me. And I was pleased about that because I'd put my project together and I was refining my human ethics research application. So if you don't know about real research, and by real I mean you can publish in peer-reviewed journals, you can speak with authority and you will be taken seriously, you must go through a Human Research Ethics Committee application. We take safety of participants really, really seriously. And if you wonder why we have that, please go back 100 years and look at what happened when there wasn't informed consent with the Tuskegee syphilis trials with Nazi Germany, with some appalling things that happened in Russia and some really unethical things that also happened in the USA. And this is why researchers like me jump through all sorts of hoops, and why anyone who participated occasionally wrote back to me and said, "Why is there information here about a support hotline? I'm just talking about my job." Because we never know when something's going to trigger something for someone. And so we do the best we can to caretake. So anyone who tells you that you have to stay in a research project is lying. You all have the right to leave at any time without any excuses or penalty. Okay? But the Rawlings research published their first paper just as I was gearing up to get my final application. And for those of you who haven't read this, and all due respect to Ms. Rawlings, who is a palliative care nurse of more than 30 years experience, she really knows the stuff in pal care. But she kind of put the Australians' backs up because she called us death doulas, and very few of us do that. We have death walkers, but mostly we're end of life. But that's okay. I asked her about that and she said, well, this is what most people are using. Okay, all right. But then she announced in the abstract of her article that end of life doulas are death doulas are working with people at the end of life in varied roles that are still little understood and can be described as similar to that of an eldest daughter, hold my coat, or to a role that has similarities to specialist palliative care nurses. For those of you who don't know what the horrible phrase eldest daughter model means, essentially it's, and by the way, I'm a feminist researcher of every stripe, which means women do enough unpaid domestic labour already. But the idea is, thank you patriarchy in traditional families, that the oldest daughter, no matter how many siblings or other family members may be living close to a parent, will drop everything and go and take care of the parents, because that's what eldest daughters do. We are not palliative care. We absolutely work well with palliative care. It makes our jobs much easier. We're a non-medical role, by the way, palliative care. Medical, hi.
I'm a little confused by the syntax in that quote. It's not clear whether the roles are little understood by the people performing them or by her, the author.
E, all of the above. This is exploratory research. My project too is exploratory research. However, for me, this may be doubly determined to represent from an insider perspective and also to try and represent as authentically as possible participants. So you're going to see a lot of quotes on slides today. And I participated in Rawlings' research, so I'm speaking with some authority about a lot of stuff that I myself and some other colleagues that I spoke to who had told me they'd participated as well. Things we'd talked about, like getting paid for our work and our purview and our own identity, not there. But this is someone who's looking, in fairness, she's looking through a lens of palliative care. But I think there is a danger in any nascent and emergent allied health role to be subsumed into better established, stronger, mainstream practices. And I know that this was discussed yesterday as well. And I think it's a point that's really important and we need to bear in mind when we talk about identity formation. And I was really pleased to see yesterday at End of Life Doula UK is all about please represent the brand. Please use our resources, they're there for you. You have something here in the UK that's extraordinary and we don't have it at the moment yet anywhere else. So End of Life Doula UK is doing something comprehensive and really a gold standard in terms of practice. But I wanted you to understand what was going on with Rawlings and the danger of representing from the outside in. We can make assumptions that aren't necessarily appropriate. All of my participants have pseudonyms because I take confidentiality really seriously. I have to do that for ethics reasons. So this is a stripper name from someone in the USA, Kitty Swelligand, and she came up with a really nice encapsulation, I thought. Palliative care, which is a medical system about comfort, not facing death. Kitty Swelligand went on to say that really, from her perspective, end-of-life doulas are about acceptance. Palliative care is about comfort. And while that may not be everything about, I think that's actually a very nice, simple encapsulation of the differences in our roles. I did have some practitioners who do have medical backgrounds, nurses who then became end-of-life doulas. Every participant who did say that they have medical training and can wear a medical hat, we're very careful to point out that when they are in the doula space, that's the space they occupy. They never ever mention being a nurse. They never ever mention having any palliative care experience on the medical side because they don't want their clients to elide and blur that space. They're not there to give that kind of advice. So all the practitioners I spoke to were really clear and really careful about holding an appropriate space for themselves as well as for their clients. Australian law, a little bit different here. We've got states and territories, so we have a federal framework to consider, and then state-based frameworks. Sometimes federal steps in and overrides. For example, Australia was the first country in the world to have assisted dying laws. And a couple of months later, after only 4 people had been able to access that system, the federal government, very conservative, thanks guys, said, no, we're not going to do that. And so Australia is now very late to the party. We have one state that offers voluntary assisted dying, but it's not a right to die law. There's lots and lots and lots of loopholes because Australia is very good at taking best practice frameworks and lots of evidence, decades in this case from other countries, and saying, yeah, we're going to make it a little bit tougher and harder, which means no one can access medical cannabis in Australia. Thanks, guys. And assisted dying is really hard. And unfortunately, what it means for people in rural and regional Victoria, they're not going to be able to die at home because their physicians don't have to help them. I'm big on the rule of law. If it's the law, do it. It means that people in country Victoria will have to travel to Melbourne, probably, to die. And I think that's quite problematic. So I do have some colleagues who are in fact working with people in the voluntary assisted dying system. However, I do want to note that law only came into effect a few months ago, and it's after my data collection finished. So I'm just putting that in here for interest and context. It doesn't actually inform my research. As you know, dying's returning home when community and neighbourhood is quite alien to some of us. And I think that one of the really beautiful parts of being an end-of-life doula is to help people reconstruct networks of support and community. And that was actually something that I asked about, but I'll get to the questions in a little bit. In Australia, we have a big bank called the Macquarie Bank. Look it up. They funded toll roads. And when that started winding down, in terms of planning and as a business model. They looked around and said to each other on the board, what can we invest in that's going to be as, if not more lucrative than building toll roads around the Sydney area? Death. I don't know about you, over here in the UK. In Australia, it's $1.3 billion a year. Death is big for a country that doesn't yet have 25 million people in it. So, underneath Macquarie Bank, we have InvoCare, which owns 290 cemeteries, crematoria, and funeral businesses in Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. They trade on the stock market. Interestingly enough, their share dropped from 36 to about 25-26% in the last financial year. If you're wondering about that, I have access through the University Library to a $1,000 plus report from IBIS World that comes out every year to 18 months. So I am actually looking at the industry research itself for this. The second largest, Propel, 5.1% of the funeral landscape. They also trade on the Australian Stock Exchange. A lot of funeral homes are misbranded now. They've been snapped up by the corporate juggernaut, and you think it's a family. It's not. And it's not regulated, so we don't have transparency. We do know, according to Choice, which is our consumer investigation watchdog, there's at least $2,000 of uninvoiced services in every funeral. Currently, home funerals, family-led funerals, or community not-for-profit, like the tender model, south of Sydney in the Port Kembla area, really growing in interest. Hashtag see Holly later. Right, so I undertook qualitative research. It's like, okay, that's great, Dr. Annetta, but what does qualitative mean? So quantitative, quantity, it's exactly what it says on the tin, big numbers. This is where you get your online surveys, or you get your interviews that are set questions. So the Rawlings research, for example, was quantitative. When I challenged the lovely research assistant who did my interview, she was a very, very nice young woman, and I said, what do you mean by spiritual? Because they just threw out a question and said, do you offer spiritual support to your clients, or what kind of, and I said, what do you mean by spiritual? I'm an atheist. If you're going to talk spirituality, I want to know exactly what you mean so I can answer you effectively and appropriately. And there was a long pause, and she said, I don't have anything for that. And so a quantitative researcher is not allowed to add anything else in. They cannot respond to questions that are a blank screen. And that's because we need to be able to take these big numbers and generalize them. Okay? So we're looking to generalize, we're looking for trends, and we're looking at statistics. And that's really valuable. This kind of research is really, it's not a question of quantitative is better than qualitative or vice versa. We actually need both because we get different things from them. I'm at the other end of the spectrum. Qualitative is smaller, and I go deep and rich. So when someone said to me, I don't quite know what to say to that, can you clarify, or can you put that in different words? I can do that as a qualitative researcher. I can then ask what we call probing, very Area 51, probing questions. That sounds really interesting. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Are you comfortable sharing that story? Thank you very much. We can have more of a conversational approach. And then I have very thick, rich data that I go through and look at thematically. Now, I'm not looking to generalize, but I can speak about trends, and I can speak about the unique aspects of the research that come forward. So when we take quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches, and we look at them as a body, we begin to get a really rich idea of what's going on. So I'm interested in lived experiences. It's probably not a surprise because I'm therapy oriented. So this is the kind of research that makes sense for me. Semi-structured interviews mean I write 6 or 7 questions. Anything more than about that, and you're going to run over your hour. And that becomes a bit problematic from an ethics perspective because people get bored and they drop out. Okay. So when I put in an ethics proposal, it's always up to an hour. So if it's 25 minutes, and some interviews are, some of us are really concise in the way we convey information, and we're not chatty. And that's fine. Some of us really just want to talk. That's fine too. But we know that there's a limit to that, so you can get on with your day. You can pick your kids up from soccer practice, or you can walk your dog. You know, you can make yourself a cup of tea, right? So we looked at death literacy. I looked at compassionate community formation and continuity of care. And I will go into what I mean by all of that in a minute. In the end, I also ended up having discussions around payment for services, accreditation, which is an interesting thing, swings and roundabouts there, professional identity, and connection to other end-of-life doulas. Everybody wanted to know what's going on in other countries. Because apparently in that moment I became the keeper of all things doula. I'm not, really not. I'm privileged enough to be able to hear people's stories. And that's a huge honour, but as we all know, it's not, and never about one person. I interviewed via Skype and Zoom. I had one person sit down and do a face-to-face interview with me because they lived close enough to me to be able to do that. So Skype and Zoom with video so we could see each other, and I had recording devices. So, and I've learned the hard way from doing interviews in my PhD, always use 2 recording devices. The batteries might fail. And then I'm a feminist researcher. So by feminist, I mean I'm very interested in breaking power hierarchies. There's a lot of power hierarchies around power in medicine and around information generally. We know that we have that in health and medicine, but I'm a researcher. I have so many letters after my name, your eyes will cross. I speak 2 languages, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I can be intimidating. That's not what I'm interested in. If quantitative researchers are often all about the power that I don't have to tell you anything about myself. I answered my participants' questions honestly. If you're sitting down and you're offering me your life story, your information, I think it's reasonable and fair that I give something back. I'm expecting you to be honest. I will be honest with you. And then I go an extra step, which drives some of my colleagues nuts. I get the transcription done, and then I hand it back to you. And you have the power to add things, take things out, and modify. Some people send me back transcripts and there's no changes, but they have had the option and the opportunity to do what they wanted with their own information. Because if I'm representing you from the inside and you as authentically as I can, to me that extra step is worthwhile. You're not necessarily going to get that from other researchers, don't get your hopes up, but I'm hoping to do more research in the future, and if you choose to be a participant and it works for you and you fit the criteria, be aware there's an extra step where I'm going to ask you to do some reading and maybe some editing, just so that you can get it right. So then when I got the authorized transcripts, that becomes my data set, and that's what I've been looking at. I'd planned on 12 interviews per country, which would give me 48. I didn't get any funding for this. I used a university's research ethics committee so that I could publish and talk about my work at conferences and gatherings. But the nice thing about qualitative research is too, if you actually reach a point where you've gotten enough information to be able to carry on, you can stop short of that. So in the end, I had 8 Australian participants, 1 Canadian, the lone Canadian keeps cropping up. The lone Canada was interesting. 9 from here in the UK and 10 from the USA. I did speak with trainers in 2 countries. And I spoke with 2 males and 26 females. Right. I'm a sociologist, which means theory shows up. It's actually a very, very important part of doing research in any field, but in sociology in particular. I just want you to note, this is the best I could do to bring my dog with me. Cully is my research assistant. This is the dog I've been talking about all weekend. And yes, there are pictures of him in my PhD thesis. It's often the only reason people crack it open. So what I was looking at was theories around communities of practice. How community identity formation occurs because we're all doing something that is the same. So it's different to a community of interest. This has a professional capacity. So Wenger from '98, it's a little bit dated, but a really, really useful text for that. But also Elliott in 2011. I've also been looking at social models of information transfer and networking. And that's Kerry Noonan, 2018, from her thesis. So further to feminist, much of the knowledge around death and death business from a corporate perspective is protected and elitist. I'm very interested in disrupting and destroying this particular power hierarchy. For example, I want to see all funeral homes disclosing exactly what they do, not services as a blanket. Tell me. My research is exploratory. I'm essentially giving myself and arguably other researchers into our field a baseline. It's not comprehensive, it's not the be-all and end-all, it's a starting point. Okay, it's small, because I'm one person. But this, I think arguably there's still a usefulness to this. I use feminist standpoint theory a lot. So this is Dorothy Smith, who is a wonderful nonagenarian Canadian sociologist. And I find her very useful because she looks at the structures that inform our legal system, our health system, everything that we do in society, and how that is gendered and how we can challenge that. So actually looking at power in a really macro, really big way, and how that then affects us at our individual, smaller scale. Also, there's a long history of females and feminists challenging biomedical knowledge and claims to power. So feminists come in every stripe and every sexual orientation and every interpretation of gender. So I do wish to be very clear that I am not conflating female and feminist here. So Canada, things don't go according to plan. There was the weird thing where people thought I was Deb Rawlings, which did put a little bit of a hiccup in things. But I did my due diligence. I'm actually a good researcher. And I had included Canada in my list of 4 nations, not only because an introductory brief analysis had pointed out that Canada is one of the countries that has end-of-life doulas, but I found a lot of websites, I found a lot of training associations. I knew that there were places I could reach out to try to get participants. And then I had 2 waves of recruitment, and Canada, radio silence. I had 2 potential participants, one due to their geographic location and some really appalling weather, which meant they were very, very late for their interview, and it was already in the middle of the night for me when I was trying not to interview. So I give people 20 minutes and then I just log off and we try again. So I ended up with 1 person who was in a better geographic location for the time change. It wasn't until the end of last year, beginning of this year, that I realized exactly what had happened. I mentioned earlier that midwife is a medicalized term in Australia. It is in Canada now too. So the trainer who did a lot of training, arguably probably was a foundational trainer, very influential in Canada. And I'm sorry, I cannot remember this person's name. Please excuse me. She went to court because she was using deaf midwife. All of her trainees were deaf midwife. Her program was about deaf midwifery. She had a construct that worked around being a deaf midwife. And that was the professional hill she chose to die on. She went to court for it, fought a really long, protracted, and I'm sure, unfortunately, very expensive battle. And she lost. The court found against her. Midwife is now officially and legally medicalised in Canada too. So in the midst of me trying to do my project, people were scrambling. Associations pulled down sites, individuals pulled down sites. Logos needed to be redone, branding needed to be redone, copy and content on websites, and all propaganda blogs had to be completely redone. And I just happened to have been right in the middle of that. So I contacted a colleague up in Scotland, and I explained to her in the course of, actually I think it was when she was interviewing me for one of her research projects. She and her colleagues are looking into end-of-life doulas as a system. They look systemically at things. So if you get in touch with me, I can give you Marion's information. Brendan is already in contact with this particular person, and I explained that I had a gap in my research. There's going to be a known gap in my knowledge base. Do you think you could go to Canada and see if you can pick it up for me? That'd be great. So hopefully Canadian information will be forthcoming in the not too distant future, but it's not going to be from me. So compassionate communities, #ComComs, are the at least, at a minimum, 16 people it takes to support someone dying at home. We know this from the Caring at End of Life research group at Western Sydney University, and my colleague Debbie Horsfall and Kerry Noonan, Rosemary Leonard were involved in a lot of this. I know that here in the UK we've got compassionate neighbourhoods and compassionate community initiatives, which is wonderful to see. And in Australia, End of Life Doulas are frequently positioned as pivotal hubs within the community for caring at end of life. And many participants talked about, were willing to talk about, because I did actually ask directly, about compassionate community formation and what that looked and felt like when they were working with clients. And Cynthia in the USA, because I thought compassionate community is going to be pretty straightforward. No. Cynthia put it beautifully. I laugh because there's so much resistance to creating compassionate communities. So question 1, how do you go about creating and building compassionate communities in your end-of-life doula network? So every quote you're going to see is from one of the UK participants. So Alex said, I do it grassroots up. A word I use for this is composting. And interestingly enough, if you haven't heard, Washington State in the northwest of the USA is the first place in the world to, in the modern world anyway, to okay composting of human remains, which is great. We now have something nice and fertile we can put on urban green spaces. Yay. Lara said, we're quite lucky because we have a lot of links. Now, Lara was referring to Yodo and community awareness and support networks. And Daria said, the way it seems to be working is that it's conversation by conversation with people who are here. A lot of it is actually friends. So a lot of slow tentacling out, building of conversation, and doing it through personal networks. Continuity of care. This is a term preferred by medical and health practitioners in Australia, including palliative care workers who refer to the spectrum of support they offer to patients. And often, we're very protectionist about our power in the biomedical model. We're the ones that offer continuity of care. Really? Because the role might be consistent, but people can drop in and out. Really? Because as an illness or a disease progresses, the teams and the roles may shift, and you get new people. Really? Because when we die, all of that falls away. Where I argue we see more consistency in terms of continuity of care are end-of-life doulas, because we're often there before palliative care is formally in place, and many of us are there long after biomedicine has stopped. So feel free to disagree with me, it's fine. Remember, I'm just one person taking a position. But this is my position. 75% of Australians would like to die at home, 14 to 15% of us are managing it at the moment. I imagine these figures are fairly analogous and in tandem with what you're seeing in the UK. Continuity of care offered by end-of-life doulas as well as compassionate communities may well see this term moving out of medicalised use and into community use. Wouldn't it be wonderful if this was a term of reference and a potential benchmark for doing death more peacefully, the best that we can for what the individual wants? I personally try not to use the term good death. I think it puts an awful lot of pressure on the performance of dying is already pressured enough. But I like this idea of continuity of care. It may come to nothing, but let's see. So question number 2. How do you go about creating, fostering, and maintaining continuity of care for your clients? I'm a little bit sneaky. If I've only got 6 or 7 questions, a couple of them are going to be stupidly complex. I had a lot of people saying, can you repeat that, please? Wait, I'm just going to write that. What? So Sheila, I always say to my clients, I will never lie to you. If I am unable to do something or don't know the answer, I will find a way to sort it, but I'll always be honest with you. Maintaining continuity is important. My client knows that I'm going to be the same as I was last time I saw them. No mood swings, no flakiness. What you see is what you get every time. Language is very important too. Lots of participants talked about language. Sophia, with my doula role at the hospital, continuity is difficult because I go in each week. I've now developed a rapport with the discharge coordinators who are a fantastic team, and they now welcome me in when I go in the morning with a coffee. So Sheila is an example. Now I also heard stories like this out of the USA. Sheila never knows who she's going to see on any given day. So her continuity is in her role, and unlike many end-of-life doulas, Sheila's in the very happy position of having a very positive relationship with the hospital. And Arkadina, you just have to listen. It's individual. It depends on the individual, and it depends on the family, and in particular the close carers. And I really think, I just construct a program around what they need. Death literacy. It's a little bit of an academic wanky term. This is Kerry, but it's Kerry Noonan's thing, and it's about the reclaiming of and the knowledge and the understandings of the processes and stages and terminology around death. All participants agreed, often quite vehemently, sometimes I got yelled at, that death literacy is vital in helping to form compassionate communities, overcome resistance to having discussions around end-of-life choice and advanced planning, and to open people's minds to the culture change of seeing death as the natural part of life. Question 3, what role do you think death literacy plays in overcoming resistance to forming compassionate communities? Natasha said, huge. Sorry, I'm just trying to think how. And I actually jumped in and said, that's a nice encapsulation, thank you. Huge is fine. You don't have to give me a 5-page answer. Ali, the death literacy, which is a bloody horrible phrase in itself, isn't it? Now, lots of people actually say, this is great, but why are we using death literacy? I'm like, well, this is what happens when you let academics name things. Get in first and name it yourself. And to just say to an ordinary person, A, we want to improve your death literacy, it's like you're calling them illiterate, and then they go, what the fuck's that? And Annetta said, it actually sounds like a peculiarly antibiotic-resistant sort of sexually transmitted disease. And Ali said, so using language like, right, so how would you like not to pay 3,000 quid for a funeral? Because sometimes that's, if I'm with someone like my spouse who's a big working class bloke from the outback, I'm not going to say death literacy. He's a tradie, by the way. He doesn't walk around talking about my job as death literacy. He says, have you got a will? You got your power of attorney? I was like, have you done your planning? Like, what's happening to your kids? It is as basic as that. So the language matters in that participants all acknowledge we've got to meet people where they are. Absolutely. We may understand what death literacy means, and we do it all the time, but we don't have to call it death literacy. So I quite like this response because it's cut right to the meat of the matter. And then Amity said, what I want to do is get a death cafe in the hospital for staff and medical students and student nurses. Amity is not the only participant to point out that what we may be better off aiming for is getting them while they're young, getting them while they're students and they're new, and they still have that shiny, new to the hospital smell on them. It's going to be harder with the older, more many of you are nodding. Yeah, I'm not, it's not like I'm telling you anything you don't already know. They, palliative care and hospital staff, thought that was such a great idea. So sometimes there's a lot of resistance that we need to sort of gently navigate, and sometimes there's somebody there that just says, yeah, this is a really good idea. Many participants talked about creating compassionate communities for themselves as practitioners, even though originally I had only thought about creating them for clients. So I got really interesting data on both sides of the coin on this one. And some people actually gave me some would say, well, I'm going to talk about how I do this for myself, and now I'm going to go over to the other side of that. And they were very clear they were going to give me two sets of answers. So question 4, what strategy or strategies have you found most effective in overcoming resistance to creating ComComs? Alex, so the strategy is now 100% grassroots up. It just relies on the profound intelligence of local people and trusting that profound intelligence. So Alex is a participant who's had some not great experiences trying to work sort of from the mid-level or top down, so Alex is now working from the bottom up. Lara and Amity both responded that they hadn't experienced resistance. Just because I ask a question doesn't mean it applies to you. So I thought it was really useful to put that in to show you that sometimes I can ask a question and you're like, what? That's meaningless, or it doesn't apply to me. Sheila uses a client agreement and the website What Matters Now. Arkadina, just listen, respond, read, respond, read, respond, read, respond. It's really tiring. I mean, I come back home exhausted. That's the most elegant summation of how deep and sometimes overwhelmingly exhausting our work is, because we're just slowly working away, trying to spread the message. And some days I come home and I feel really energized, and some days I come home and I'm knackered, and I'm not sure I want to do this anymore, because it is really hard work. And Ali, somebody has to be touched by it, death, or has been touched or affected by it, and then I think you can bring the community together. Question 5. Where have you experienced the most interest and support for forming compassionate communities? Sometimes I like to turn things around, and it's one thing to actually ask people to consider resistance and struggle and difficulty or challenge, but then, okay, so what's worked really well? What's good? What's positive? So Lara, at the moment I would probably say among hospices. Sophia, the chaplaincy. I'm looking at what we need to do within the hospital to improve end-of-life care. Natasha, my work colleagues, I would say, with my childbirth and also end-of-life doulas. Sorry, there's a typo there, excuse me. From my clients, very much, but sadly not from the establishment. And Arkadina, really only from within the end-of-life doula movement. So that isn't a taste of just how broad areas of acceptance can be. And that's just in one country. And a few people. Question 6, how do clients approach continuity of care and compassionate communities with an end-of-life doula acting as a linchpin or nexus for those support networks? This was the easy one. I'm going to write that down. Please repeat that 4 times. Sheila said relieved. It's a relief that I'm there to hold that for them. Natasha said, I think it allows them to think about what they want and what is possible. Alex, my experience is the antithesis of one size fits all. There is no commonality in this. It's always unique to the situation. It, dying, asks us to be in a very social environment, even though the irony is that we are all withdrawing as we go into it. And I think that's a beautiful articulation of the tension and that still point of the community aspect of death and dying, and anticipatory grief coming hard up against actual grief in the moment of dying. Ali, quite often people want us to coordinate it because it's all too bloody much, it's all too bloody too much.
Did you say that? You said fucking bloody and all that.
It's not me.
These are all, remember? Pseudonyms, people. Yep. And I laughed at it, and I come back to this particular phrase frequently when I'm thinking about work, because for me, on a note of transparency, a lot of what I do is about trying to support by easing the weight of the overwhelm, easing some of that burden, even when it's not possible. I still try. So that one really resonated for me. Lara, from the right place at the right moment and making sense of the whole offering that compassionate communities have for the people who are involved in the dying process. And Daria, just reminding them that it's all bullshit in a way, and they're in charge. Yeah. Now, question 7, Alex said, that is sneaky. It's a very sneaky question. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I write the questions and I know what I'm thinking about and I know what my practice is as an end-of-life doula. And I think I know how to write reasonable foundation questions. But I'm not all things doula, and I'm certainly not all things research. And I, as a qualitative researcher, I can throw in a question that says, is there anything else you want to put in? What would you like to see? So I had a few requests for, are you going to do more research? Like, I certainly hope so. I want to really, had a shower and some sleep, yes. And I would hope maybe even to do this as a small team and try and attract some funding. Because a few people asked me, do we have any comparisons between dying with doula and dying without doula? So I heard that one, particularly in Australia. But from here in the UK, let's throw in spiritual life, said Alex, but God without religiosity. So I did get interesting reflections from many participants about their own religious or spiritual inner support, or the way that they work with clients, or what they find important. And that's all really rich. I think we need to understand what's going on. And I'm an ideal person to do that because I'm an atheist. I'm not batting for any team. And I try and be inclusive. So Natasha said, people who are living with consciousness are dying younger and they want to do it differently. I have to be kind of hopeful that it's not just about death, but it's our way in, zooming in and looking at the bigger picture. So I think that here Natasha's actually coming at the point that Alex had made earlier about withdrawing and cocooning, to use Hannah Gadsby's term, when she was watching her grandmother dying. Cocooned within herself is a lovely phrase. But we're also really social, and that's when we're really part of a community, ideally. And Sheila said, to watch a family unit go from not knowing who is doing what, full of trepidation, to a family unit that has structure, personally suited roles, is great to witness. Yeah, there's a lovely, lovely moment in the room there. Because some people just want to be making the tea or walking the dog. Not necessarily the immediate care, but the things around that support the immediate care. Some of us are not in the room of the 16. And we can be as part of a family unit and not in the room all the time. And that's something else I think that's really profound and wonderful and essential in the role of End of Life Doula, that we are able to help facilitate that and help families and support networks realize that. I do want to add something. I'm going to go back to the beginning. And I wanted to mention something about Rawlings and the eldest daughter model again. And it's become more and more apparent as my research has gone on. The eldest daughter model also invisibilizes non-binary people and men. And I think it's really important. It's 2019, for heaven's sake. We don't need to just be talking about women doing care work or men and women. We're people. And inclusive practice is at the heart of a lot of what many of us say we do. So I had meant to say that at the beginning, sorry, but it's important, so I did want to get that in. So I basically found that all practitioners are concerned with validating the wishes of clients, being really client-centric and client-led and client-focused, and being present for those at end of life. Silence, listening, non-judgment support, healthy self-care. Thank you, Flora, and who was the other person yesterday? That lovely self-care workshop. And networking, teamwork mostly. Some of us work alone and like it. And some of us really like teams. And an interest in learning more over time were all prominent themes that have emerged from the interviews. Almost all practitioners knew someone or were themselves someone who had had a negative experience with death and were galvanized to find out how we could do death better in our communities. Many would like to have standardized pricing for services in their country, or at least a framework to work from. And most would like to have more contact with end-of-life doulas in other countries. Right. I was given a little brief by the powers that be, Ali and Lizzie. The findings on scope and breadth of role and differences in approach, being paid, recognition and funding by the mainstream, certification and accreditation, thoughts on universal and international scheme for accreditation and recognition, proper mentoring and supervision of practicing doulas, and examples of any dodgy practices. Right. Dodgy practices, funeral directors. Not the nice, independent, like the big corporate after death, capitalist juggernaut. Really dodgy. Haven't yet come across dodgy doulas? I don't think. But I'll keep you posted. Universal and international scheme for accreditation and recognition. Yes. tricky. In Australia, for example, Medicare, which is our NHS, they're not taking on any more professions. I went through this when I did my Masters in Art Therapy and wrote quite a lot about this in my PhD on the Australian and New Zealand Art Therapy Association. Yeah, you can spend $25,000, $30,000 getting a master's degree and join the association, and it's meaningless because anyone can call themselves an art therapist. The recognition and accreditation, therefore, is going to be expensive. There is one trainer in Australia who allied with an extant organisation, and the moment they did that, their prices went up $1,000 overnight. And the training is not that great, and I can say that with authority because I've done it. It's fine, it's okay. No one, by the way, in the world has what you have here. I'm going to go on record and say that from what I know at this point in time here today, in September 2019, this is the gold standard that I found in the world. Congratulations. 21 days of training. You know how much the longest is in Australia? 5. And then you can add on other bits and pieces. And each of them have strengths and each of them have weaknesses. I had someone ask a really interesting question here today, here at the gathering yesterday. What about an elders training? I haven't looked as deeply at an elders as I would like to. I'm writing a book at the moment for Palgrave Macmillan. I'm a bit busy. I will get around to it. But I know that it's not doing what this group does because every single participant in the USA talked about the need to form their own support groups. So organically, which is great, organically, doulas are coming together and it's regional and geographic, et cetera, but they're doing it themselves. Nobody talked about mentoring, so that is absent. And we know how essential that is. There is one person in Australia who's attempting to set up mentoring, and I have been involved with that, but I'm sort of pulling back from it because it was set up in a fairly tired, so I have to be careful how I say this on camera. It was set up in a with good intentions, but incompletely, and the students don't really understand what's going on. And a lot of the actual mentors don't really quite understand what's going on, and communication is not good and not consistent. So yes, I would say that this is it. Congratulations, you're doing really, really well. I don't think we're anywhere near, and please feel free to disagree with me. I'm perfectly entitled to be wrong. I don't think we're ready yet to begin connecting in terms of international standards. I think that's going to take at least 2 to 3 years. This field is growing really rapidly. It's exploding. And I think it's that careful tandem holding of not over-expanding and it implodes. We've all seen businesses do that. But also not leaving it so long that maybe something else comes into place and it's detrimental or not as good as it might be. And I'm not saying I have an answer to that, I can just see the pitfalls. But accreditation is going to be a little bit tricky, I would argue. Funding and recognition by the mainstream, gods, I hope so. But I am also resigned to the knowledge that in Australia, I am in private practice. And I do charge for my services, which means that I am able to offer pro bono work. I can do that. There is a big drive at the moment to make everything volunteer, and I think that's incredibly dangerous. See earlier comments about women doing enough unpaid labour, except, oh, we just want to get people in. Okay, but then that's permanently devalued. And then how do you regain any sense of status and expect people to pay for you? We don't take seriously that which is given away. Right. So that's me, champagne for everyone. Have another picture of Cully holding a squeaky toy in his mouth. And if you are interested, if you enjoy reading, there's the references that I used during the slides. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Annetta. Thank you very much. This is massive. She's come all the way to do this, to be with us, so we really, really appreciate it.